Let me preface this by saying that I work in a well-populated town with a low crime rate, and no reason to outright assume any of these actions were what I later found out to be trafficking attempts. So I work at a popular coffee chain, generally doing afternoon closing shifts. This night in particular, we had a very young crew for closing, which happens at 10:30 p.m. For reference too, we have our shift lead, 19 female. Her name is Sarah. Myself, 17 female. My co-worker, 17 female. Her name is Mia. And another co-worker, 18 and female. Her name is Dee. Now, it had been a relatively slow night, with only a few loyal regulars dropping by. Both drive-through and the cafe were pretty much empty, as heavy rainfall had started and no one wanted to be out. I was in the front of the store cleaning while the rest of my co-workers were in the back of the store, when an older man walks in. He wore odd clothing, a bit strange for the humid weather, a full black attire with combat boots, a heavy red jacket, and a beanie on his head obscuring his hair. I brushed it off as protection from the storm and figured that he worked outside, and went to ask if he had placed an online order as he stood at the mobile counter. Putting on my customer service voice, I smiled and went through my standard spiel, but was alarmed when instead of responding, he places a bag on the counter and starts pulling out DVDs. Once he finishes pulling out a stack of 10 or so, he stares past me into the back room where my co-workers were obliviously chatting, and then makes a sort of lap around the store, eyeing me the entire time, not speaking a word. He backs out of the front door and walks out to his truck, which I now see is a large black pickup. Freaking out now, I stupidly grab the stack of DVDs and run back to my co-workers. They're immediately alarmed by my demeanor and ask me what's wrong. I hold out the DVDs and let them inspect them while I explain what happened. Much to my discomfort, Sarah points out that all of the movies are about either murders or kidnappings. Slightly ticked off by this and extremely uncomfortable, we make the decision to call my manager. He picks up, and Sarah explains the situation, while I comfort Dee and Mia, who are freaked out, probably more so than I am at this time. He tells us that there's nothing that we can do about it, but to call back if anything else happens. So we hang up and move back to the front of the store as a group. Things pretty much go on as usual as well, but with an air of fear about us, I guess. Mia sticks to my side and Dee to Sarah's. The man's truck had pulled off at that point, but much to my dismay, had only pulled into the now closed grocery store next door that had a clear view into the drive-through window. A few cars pulled through the drive-through, and I even had a few customers ask if I was alright, due to my, what I assumed to be terrified face. I've always had a pretty good intuition about things, and this felt more wrong than anything else I'd ever felt. A bit more time passes though, and it's now time for Dee to leave. With the man still in the parking lot next door, we decided that it would probably be best for her boyfriend, Daniel, to come and pick her up. This wasn't an irregular occurrence too, and we didn't want him following her home. Mia then points out that a van had been sitting in the back of the parking lot for almost an hour at that point, which we had not noticed previously. Another gut feeling hits at this point, and I make the decision to lock the door. Daniel tells her that he's on the way, and I inform my manager that we close the cafe for peace of mind, which he was fine with as business was slow anyway. Now, Sarah and Dee are in the back, and Mia and I are up front. I go about cleaning the machines and trying to make idle chatter to keep her calm, which is no small feat, let me tell you, as she jumps every time she hears someone steaming milk. As we're talking, and I have my back turned to her, she screams mid-sentence, "Get out!" Alarmed, I whip around to where she is standing near the counter, close to the drive-through window, and saw her pointing to a shadowy figure climbing through that window. The next few moments were just a blur of adrenaline-rushed thinking and what I can only explain as extreme divine intervention. It genuinely cannot be explained by anything other than some grand divine plan to keep myself and my co-workers alive. But grabbing her arm, I yank Mia behind me and grab the hot bucket of sanitizer that I had been using to scrub the counters around the machines with. I throw the liquid onto him, simultaneously pushing the man out the window, which he had only had his shoulders through, with a big red bucket now on his head. If you work in food service, you know the ones. Bulky things. At the same time, Daniel pulls up outside. Mia is now yelling for someone to call the police, and I see Dee in my peripheral running outside to our new saviour. I slam the drive-through windows shut and lock them, with the man still laying on the ground struggling to get his bearings. I couldn't tell you how much time passed, although it couldn't have been more than like 50 to 30 seconds before I see Daniel rush the man who was now on his knees and pin him to the ground. Sarah and Mia were now pulling me to the back of the store, with both fighting back sobs and Sarah on the phone with the police. Thankfully, we have some awesome regulars who are also deputies that arrived within 5 minutes of our call and arrested the man. The aftermath was messy, but they eventually pinned him as a member of a local trafficking ring that had been caught years prior and let out on bail. Oh yeah, and the van in the back that had kept Dee from leaving in the first place, it hightailed it out of the parking lot in the middle of all the action, but was eventually traced back to people who were also a part of that ring. Even though I won't be releasing names or such as legal proceedings are still happening, I figured that I would tell my story here, and I still work there and am very grateful for Daniel, who very well could have saved all of our lives in that moment. He managed to keep the man pinned the entire time until the police arrived and disarmed him. He really is the true hero of this story, although I do pride myself on quick thinking for getting him out of the store. Anyway, moral of the story, trust your gut feelings, and always have a steaming hot bucket of sanitizer on hand. Oh, and the DVDs, I should probably mention their relevance other than scaring everyone. The police did check them out during the investigation, which is technically ongoing, but found that they were blank. In my terms of terrible explanation, to them it looked like he burned blank DVDs, but unsuccessfully, so whatever was supposed to be on them didn't stick, allegedly. But they weren't the original DVDs. We never bothered to open them when they were in our hands anyway. But a part of me thinks that the police, they may be lying to me about it to hide the fact that there was something really bad on them. But I try not to think about all of that too much. So, they lived in Connecticut, and it's where I grew up. This happened when I was like 14. It was either right after Ed Warren passed away or not too long after. Me and my dad, we were staying at my aunt's house one night. It was a two-family house, so her and my uncle, as well as my cousin, her husband and their 2 children, they all lived there. It was a new house they had just built and moved in a couple of months back. I found this part out later, by the way. But leading up to that night, my aunt was having crazy dreams where a little boy would appear in her dreams every night, or so she thought they were dreams, and let her out of bed. My aunt said that the outside of the house was a very bright light that shone through the windows to the point where she couldn't see anything outside, and the little boy would try to lead her outside. But my aunt would always be found in the morning by my uncle around the house, passed out on the bathroom floor, the living room, even the garage one time. They just assumed that my aunt was sleepwalking. So, anyway, that night at about 2 a.m. or so, everyone hears this loud screaming coming from the upstairs living room. Me and my dad and my aunt and uncle all wake up and run upstairs because it sounded like somebody was hurt. We get up there, and my cousin and her husband are in the living room, and my cousin's son, who was about 2 years younger than me, was sitting in a rocking chair. His back was to us, but my cousin and husband were freaking out. So my dad and my uncle walked over to my cousin and went to see what was wrong. My uncle touched his shoulder, and he turned his head around, and it was bright red. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin was starting to turn this weird greyish colour. When they tried asking him what was wrong, he started speaking in another language and was rocking in the chair back and forth. Now, he was known as a kind of prankster of a kid, so my uncle and my cousin's husband, thinking that he was playing around, yelled at him to stop and went to grab him out of the chair. But when they touched him that time, he let out a huge scream, again in another language of some sort, and his eyes started to roll in the back of his head. We all started freaking out at this point, not knowing what to do. My cousin went and got a glass of water, thinking that maybe he was sleepwalking, and threw it on him, and he just laughed in this really creepy and sort of deeper voice. My aunt was a pretty holy woman. She would keep crosses and angel statues and even holy water in the house, so she ran back downstairs to get the holy water because at this point, we realized something weird was going on. My dad and my uncle grabbed him out of the chair. He was kicking and trying to fight them the whole time, and held him on the floor. My aunt brings over the holy water and rubs it in her hands. My cousin lifts up his shirt while he's being held down, and my aunt places her hand on his back, and it literally burnt him. In fact, it left a burn mark the exact size of her hand on his back. He screamed and screamed for a couple of seconds before he ended up just passing out. I'm just standing there the whole time, absolutely terrified, not moving and just watching all of this happen. So he's passed out and not knowing what to do, they call the police. It's probably around 3 a.m. at this point. So the police come with the paramedics and talk to us all, and the meds check out my second cousin to see if he's okay. He ended up waking up and they said that he was fine, save the still having the burn mark on his back. Not knowing what to do, the police recommended that they give Mrs. Warren a call since she was a famous paranormal investigator and lives right in CT. So nobody ends up going to bed at all that night, and me and my dad leave in the late morning. Now, this next part I wasn't there for, but about a week later my aunt gives Mrs. Warren a call, tells her about what happened, and invites her to the house. Apparently Lorraine knew what the house was about before she even stepped foot in there. Apparently the newly built house was built on land that housed some kind of a portal to the other dimension or something. I don't know, but the little boy in my aunt's dream was trying to lead my aunt outside through this portal apparently, because if a human entered the portal, it would be open enough for demons to constantly go through. Apparently one got through and was able to possess my second cousin because he wasn't strong enough to fight it. Well, Lorraine ends up doing this whole seance and cleansing of the house to get rid of it all and close it permanently. And they ended up living in that house for about another 8 years without any problems ever again, before selling it and moving out of state. I never did stay over there again though, and to this day, that night, it still haunts me. So this is another good old story from South Africa. As people from there know too, there's a lot of game farms, lodges, etc., especially around the area of Kruger National Park. This incident took place in a very tranquil 4-star game farm close to the southern tip of the above-mentioned Kruger National Park as well. So, we frequented the lodge often over the 5 years before this incident, as it was a favourite with me and my wife, then girlfriend. The lodge had a very nice central area with pool, restaurant, etc., and then the tents were spread out around, with the furthest one about maybe a kilometre from the restaurant. The chalets were very private and set up in the bush, so you could not see the next one over, and could only hear your neighbours if they were really loud. Sadly, the lodge has fallen on hard times and has gone backwards a bit. The weekend this incident took place, only 2 of the 25-plus units were occupied for the Friday night, and we were the only ones there for the Saturday night. It did make me feel a little bit uneasy, if I'm being honest. But to make matters worse, the lodge or the farm manager came by on Saturday morning saying that he's leaving the farm for the weekend, if we need anything to just help ourselves in the restaurant fridges, and leave a note, and then we can settle the bill next week. Sure, no problem. We have the pool and the jacuzzi all to ourselves. We left to go for a visit to the KNP after the manager left and stayed out most of the day. We got back around 3 p.m. and as we got out of the car, I just got goosebumps. It was 35 degrees Celsius out, like over 100 Fahrenheit, so I definitely didn't get cold or anything. As we approached, we parked about 150 meters from the place that we were staying and had a little path that we walked down. And as we approached, I noticed big shoe prints over mine and my girlfriend's prints from this morning. That seriously put me on edge. I approached the place that we were staying and noticed the prints turn around and walk back the way that they came. But everything seemed in order. We went for a swim and a bit of a game drive around the farm and returned at around 5:30. Started to make the fire, barbecue the meat, and prepare some other food. Both me and my girlfriend seemed on edge though, and we were just really quiet. We sat down to eat at around 8 p.m, and as we sat down I looked at my girlfriend. She looked worried. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that she was having a bad feeling and that we should go. I said that I felt the same and we need to leave now, not after we ate, but right then. So we chucked our food in the cooler, grabbed our bags, and we ran to the car, jumped in, and almost raced out of there. As we went out the gate, we dropped the keys in the box and drove away, and the feeling of dread slowly went away. We made the 150-kilometer, almost 100-mile drive home in the dark and slept in our own bed. We woke up on Sunday and went about our day as normal. At about 4 p.m. that afternoon, though, my phone rings and I see it's the number from the lodge manager. I answer and he frantically asks if we're okay, and I say, yeah, of course, why? He starts explaining and my veins go ice cold. Apparently, the lodge was broken into and ransacked this Saturday night. They took everything of value, and what they could not take, they destroyed. It was a group of 5 men that did it, and apparently there was no evidence that they ransacked any chalets as well. Only one. The one that my girlfriend and I were booked into. The one that we would have been sleeping in had we not left so abruptly the previous night. So that means that they were watching us. The lodge had cameras, but the chalet did not, and we left just after 8 p.m, probably about 8:10 when we had everything in the car and started driving. And at about 8:20 when we left the farm, as it was about 2 kilometers from the lodge to the gate down to a gravel road, the cameras caught the first signs of movement at the lodge just before 8:30, and at least one was visibly armed with a firearm in the footage, and a few had machetes. I shudder to think what would have happened had we have been there. The nearest people would have been like over 3 kilometers away in a straight line, and we were completely alone on that farm. There was only a little bit of cell reception to at the lodge, and none where we were staying. In other words, there was no way that we would have been able to call for help. Needless to say, we did not go to lodges or isolated areas for a long time after that. And sadly, the lodge and the farm went under not long after this, and I saw ads that it was being sold on a bank auction. That incident, it shocked us both quite a bit, and we vowed to always trust our instincts and intuition after it, and to tell each other if something felt off. We both have had that uneasy feeling since about 3 that afternoon when we came back, and the reason neither of us said anything was because we didn't want to spoil the weekend for the other. And that almost cost us, possibly, the ultimate price. So, the lesson that we learned here is to trust your gut. Trust your partner's gut feeling too. If something feels off, it's probably because it is. And it may just save your life, like it did for us. Back in the late 2000s, I had just finished my useless degree and was struggling to find work. I was living in a Midwestern college town where everyone and their dog had some higher level education, so it wasn't uncommon to find people with PhDs working for like $10 an hour at a cashier, but the town was cute and affordable, so people liked to stay post-graduation. I found a decent job at a coffee shop over the summer, but once the fall semester started, my hours were cut and I was replaced with cheaper, younger baristas. A co-worker suggested that I start nannying. I wasn't particularly interested in working with kids, but she assured me that it was good money, and so I decided to join a website for nannies and babysitters, and very quickly was contacted by a family. I met the parents for a quick interview and was hired fairly quickly. The pay was excellent and the hours were great, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m, so I had the evenings to myself and free weekends. Both parents were professors at the local university, and they had 2 children and were expecting their third very soon. Henry was 8 and Jane was 3. Both children were incredibly intelligent, Jane particularly so, and had the vocabulary of a much older child. I was primarily responsible for her, since Henry spent most of his day in school. Jane was a very serious little girl, though. She could carry on very in-depth conversations, and I used to joke with her that she was like a 60-year-old trapped in a toddler's body. Henry, though, Henry was a beautiful kid, I'll give him that. He had thick, dark, curly hair, long eyelashes, piercing blue eyes, and dimples. He has the ability to be sweet, loving, and funny, but I quickly learned that this was a skill set that he only used when it benefited him. Overall, Henry was a true monster. Now, I have an older brother and 2 younger brothers, so I'm familiar with sibling relationships, and I know fighting is normal. But Henry, he tormented Jane. I've never seen a child get so much joy out of causing pain, fear, and discomfort to another human being. He loved nothing more than to terrify her with stories or monsters or ghosts. He had convinced Jane that there was a demon living in their basement, and she refused to go down with me when I had to do the laundry. Over a couple of weeks, I had slowly got her to sit on the bathroom step and play while I folded clothes so I could keep an eye on her. She was proud of her bravery too, but when Henry came home and saw that she had conquered her fears, he made it his duty to terrify her even more, and all progress was soon lost. He was so terribly mean to his little sister that I was worried about her physical safety when he was home. He would constantly taunt her, pinch her, threaten her, and destroy her belongings. I despised the hour that I had with him every evening after picking him up from school. The entire time would be filled with crying and screaming and his refusal to obey anything that I asked him to do. I would try to tell him off occasionally. I'd say that he couldn't act however he wished, that he was a child, I was the adult, etc. I would say, "You aren't the king of this castle, Henry." This is my parents used to say to me. And he would say, "I am the king. I'm King Henry. Off with your head." He would always respond like that, and he was pretty much right. I didn't have any less control over him than his parents, too. They, Elizabeth and Michael, were absolutely clueless. Dad was work-obsessed and incredibly hands-off. Mum was a sweetheart, but also a doormat, and allowed both kids to just walk all over her. They had no discipline whatsoever, so a lot of Henry's behaviors, they sort of made sense. Why would he need to behave if no one ever made him? I was shocked to watch how Henry treated his mother, though, and how she allowed him to mock her, call her names, and act aggressively towards her. It wasn't unusual for him to tell her that she looked ugly and needed to go change or put her hair down, and she'd always go and do it. He threatened to punch her stomach if she didn't do what he wanted. He'd pinch her in the back of her arms when she displeased him. She made excuse after excuse for his behavior, calling him exceptionally bright and bored and having a difficult time adjusting to her pregnancy. When the baby was born, though, things got even worse. Thankfully, he didn't attempt to hurt baby Peggy, but his aggression and violence towards his mother and Jane got so much worse. One afternoon, he found his mum's sewing needles and tried to trick Jane into sitting on one. When it didn't work, he just stuck one right into her tiny arm. She screamed, and I freaked out and removed it and called both parents ASAP. Elizabeth arrived home, concerned for Jane, and for the first time seemed at least frustrated by Henry's behavior. She attempted to scold him, and he became so enraged, though, that he started punching her in her newly postpartum stomach. She only responded by crying and hugging him and asking him why he was so angry and wanted to hurt his sister. He responded with a cold, "I'm angry because you should have miscarried them both. They both should have died inside of you." my jaw must have hit the floor that day. Elizabeth stopped crying and just stared at him, and then me. I assumed that they were going to potentially get this kid some help, but when I approached the subject the next day, I was brushed off and told that they had had a talk with Henry and it was just an outburst due to an unrelated issue at school. Another excuse, really. Henry continued to torment the entire family, but then he started to target me as well. For the past few months, he mostly ignored me. He'd occasionally call me ugly or throw the laundry I'd just folded all over the room, but he had yet to get physical with me. But this all changed one day when I unfortunately had the day off from school, so I got to spend the entire day with him home, while also caring for Jane and Peggy. It was challenging, but by 10 a.m., he was bored of torturing Jane and went to go and play in his room. The rest of the morning went decently, with him occupied in his room until lunch, where he spilled his plate all over the table because I didn't cut his crust the right way. I just cleaned it up. I had admitted my defeat weeks ago anyway. I couldn't enforce any rules or boundaries if the parents didn't back me up. But I put the girls down for a nap, and Henry asked me to read him a story. For the first time, too, he was calm and genuinely sweet with me. I read him the BFG, and he cuddles a bit closer. I thought for a bit that maybe this kid just really needs more one-on-one time. I was about 30 minutes into the book when I felt a small hand reach under my skirt and touch my stomach. I looked at him and he stared at me. I gently picked up his hand and told him that it wasn't appropriate to touch other people without asking. He seemed angry, but let me continue reading. I noticed that he had stopped paying attention to the story and was sort of looking me all over. Before I could ask him what was wrong, his hand was under my shirt and making his way for my breast when I yanked it away and stood up. I tried not to yell, told him that was incredibly inappropriate and that he's never to touch anyone underneath their clothes ever again like that. Henry looked at me and then he said, "I can touch whoever I want, wherever I want, whenever I want. You can't stop me, and no one can stop me." I was creeped out, obviously, and felt violated. I know that he was just a kid, but just imagine how that feels as an adult woman. I know children aren't the best with personal space boundaries, but Henry was almost 9 now, and I knew that he knew what he did wasn't appropriate or okay. The intent behind it, honestly, seemed sinister. I ended our story session quickly after that, and I tried to get through the rest of the day. I was really glad that he'd be back at school for the rest of the week, but I did decide to let his mother know because it felt weird not to. She thought that it was funny, though. She kind of chuckled and said that he's a very sensory-orientated kid and it was just trying to be affectionate or something. At that point, I honestly decided that I was never going to talk sense into these parents and I needed to look for another job quickly. I knew that I was going to put my 2 weeks in pretty soon. I was very sad because I was close to Jane and Peggy and felt like I was abandoning them, but I had discussed Henry's behavior with my roommate, and she was concerned about potential legal ramifications for me if Henry did something to one of the girls on my watch. I came back to work on Monday, and Jane, she had a black eye. Henry had accidentally punched her in the eye during an argument. I was really sad for her, and I asked her what happened later, and she told me that she was playing in her room when Henry came in, took her doll, and when she tried to grab it back, he punched her square in the eye and just laughed at her. Henry was so evil at home, though, that I wondered why his teacher never seemed to mention any behavioral issues in the classroom. One evening, though, while picking her up, I mentioned Henry was very difficult at home and wondered if she had any issues with him at school. She said no, that he was actually very well behaved. Had no issues and had a lot of friends, in fact. I was really surprised by that. I assumed Henry was disturbed and that his poor behavior just transferred into class. But the teacher denied all of this. I quite frankly didn't believe her, so one afternoon the girls and I left early and arrived at his school so I could see how he interacted. But she was completely right. He sat at his desk quietly, raised his hand, seemed genuinely friendly to his peers. And for some reason, this stark difference in Henry's personality from home to school really terrified me, even more than normal. Initially, I thought that he was just a disturbed kid, but at that moment, I realized how truly in control he was. Henry wasn't just an angry child with severe behavioral issues. Henry was just a mean person who knew when and where he could get away with his favorite pastime, causing misery. Thankfully, I managed to find an entry-level position in a field related to my degree in spring. I have my 2 weeks, and Elizabeth was upset, but she understood. Henry, however, was absolutely livid. He made sure to tell me daily how much he hated me and how glad he was that I was leaving and how he hoped that I would die. I was feeling less than patient with his antics, so sometimes I replied a little more sarcastically than I should have to a 9-year-old child. But on my last day, Friday, my treat to Elizabeth and Michael was to let them have a date night. I picked up Henry from school at 2:55 and we headed home. Henry refuses to talk to me. He wouldn't even look at me. He wouldn't even acknowledge me. I thought that may not be the worst way to spend the next 6 hours, to be honest, when it happened, but we arrived home, and shortly after, Elizabeth and Michael came in and started to get ready for their date. The baby was about 5 months old at this point, and they hadn't been out since her birth the fall before. Typical Henry refused to speak to anyone, and Elizabeth got worried and thought about cancelling the date, not wanting to see Henry upset, but I wrongly assured her that things would be fine, and they left around 6 p.m. The older two went to bed at around 8 p.m. and the baby an hour before, so I only had to make it about maybe 2 more hours with Henry. We ordered pizza. He refused to eat. He just sat there and sulked in his chair. I let them watch about 30 minutes of the Magic School Bus on my laptop, a treat since they didn't own a TV, while I bathed the baby, gave her a bottle, and put her down in her crib. And quite honestly, I was pretty surprised I didn't even hear a peep coming from downstairs. No crying or screaming, and I felt a bit victorious that Henry was so stubborn in his silent treatment that he didn't even realize how easy he was making this evening. When I got into the living room, I then noticed that Henry had a sly grin on his face, the first one that I had seen all day. I let the episode finish. I took the computer and noticed it was incredibly sticky. I quickly realized that it was honey and that Henry had gone into the kitchen and put a solid glob in his hands and rubbed it all over the bottom of the back of the computer. I was just relieved, though, that he didn't get the keyboard, to be honest. I took it into the kitchen, though, and wiped it off, and then I heard Jane scream. I ran into the living room, and Henry was sat there with Jane right next to him, with her hand squeezed tightly with his right hand, and one of the kitchen knives in the other hand. I froze. I demanded that he put the knife down immediately and let his sister go. I told him that this wasn't funny and that he'd crossed a line. He, on the other hand, just smiled. I went to grab Jane, and she cried, and Henry just chuckled. He said, "I really scared you. You know, I could have killed her while you were upstairs, and you would have never known." The blood drained from my face. The anger that I felt towards him turned into fear, and then the realization that, you know what, he was right. I felt really stupid. I rarely left them alone together because it usually ended in Jane being pinched, pushed, slapped, or bit, but I guess that I let my guard down given his docile behavior all day. I just started to cry and screamed at him to never ever do that again, and to go straight to his room. He just sat and stared and went to the kitchen and put the knife back, and then quietly went upstairs. I was obviously super shaken up and was still trying to calm down as I bathed Jane and got her ready for bed. I told her that I was sorry and asked if he had hurt her, and she said that he hadn't. I was about as angry with myself as I was at him. I could see Henry in his room playing with his Hot Wheels set, and I told him that he needed to have the lights out by 8:30 and that he could tuck himself in. He stared at me and shut the door to his room, and I prayed that that would be the last time that I saw him for the night. I got Jane into bed and was reading her a story when I heard his door creak open. I got up and it looked as if he had creaked the door, but the lights were off. I continued reading until I suddenly heard Peggy start to gently cry, but she sounded close. I immediately sprung up, and outside the doorframe, I could see Henry holding the baby over the banister. I couldn't even scream. I've never moved so fast in my life. I got to Peggy quickly, and I grabbed her, and I just ran back into Janie's room. I shut the door, and I shouted at Henry, asking him why he would do this, which was a stupid question. I knew why. To torment me. To make me realize how easily he could access his younger sisters and potentially hurt them. Henry could have dropped Peggy, and he could have hurt Jane with that knife, but he didn't. And I don't think that that was ever the intention. He just wanted to let me know that I wasn't doing my job nearly as well as I thought, and that in the end, he was the one, always in control. It took a while to calm myself down and the girls and get them to sleep. It was close to 9 by that time, and I left their bedrooms and saw that Henry was still up in his room, reading on his bed. And at that, I just kind of looked at him. I was so relieved that this was my last day dealing with this kid and all of his terrible antics, but I also felt really sad and scared for his sisters. I told him that it was time for bed and that I was going to tell his parents about what had happened. He didn't respond. I turned out the lights, and then I heard him call my name. And he said, "You can tell them, but it's a waste of your time. You're just lucky. You're really lucky. I can do what I want. I can hurt who I want. I can touch who I want. You're all really lucky." And at that, I just shut the door and left. Elizabeth and Michael came home a little later than expected, and they paid me. I didn't mention what happened that night because it felt, well, pointless, but the next day I ended up sending a text. I got a long response from Elizabeth full of excuses about Henry like normal, and she even insinuated that I lied. And I was over it. I was over all of them. And yes, I did end up contacting CPS, but I'm not sure if anything ever came of it. I don't believe that Henry was being abused or anything. I've told this story to others and people always ask me that, but no, I don't think that that was the cause. I honestly think that Henry was born a sociopath, and his parents were enablers who never made him accountable for his actions, and the two together created a monster. I didn't hear from them for over a decade. I moved across the country. I'm married now and I have kids. My son is almost 6 years of age and he has 2 little sisters that are 3. They fight, but he loves them and is really protective and knows what a healthy relationship between siblings should look like. Anyways, a few weeks ago I got a friend request on Facebook from Elizabeth. She looks the same, a few more lines, but still very elegant and pretty. Her profile picture consists of herself and her now 4 children. I glanced across the photo until my eye caught a young man with thick curly hair and bright blue eyes. It was Henry. Henry ended up as stunning looking as expected. He's about to be a sophomore at a well-known elite American university. He plays for their soccer team and is majoring in business. He has a girlfriend and seems popular in his fraternity. And this is all I can gather through his public Facebook posts. Who knows, maybe he learned accountability and grew out of his mean-spirited and manipulative way. I can only hope that that's true for his siblings' sake, as well as the well-being of those around him. For now, though, my family is thousands of miles away from Henry, and I honestly don't care if I ever see him again. But if I ever do, I handled him then, and I'll definitely handle him again. This was about 4 years ago. I went over to my friend's house for my first sleepover there, ever, and quite honestly, I was dreading it, as I suffer from extreme separation anxiety, so I was already nervous. But it started off normal. My friend and I were basically just chatting all night. Though at about 11:30 at night, we heard the kitchen door open. But we were sleeping in a room connected to the kitchen, so if you were standing in the kitchen, you could see us. In walked my friend's dad, and he stood there to see if we were awake, and like any 12-year-old, we would pretend that we were asleep. Once his dad was sure that we were asleep again, we saw him open the pantry door and step inside, leaving a small gap, just big enough to look out and watch us. Both me and my friend saw this, and after about 15 minutes of dead silence, I whispered to my friend asking what his dad was doing. He said that he wasn't sure and that he'd never done this before. After about 45 minutes of him staying in there, me and my friend started having doubts about what we saw, so I volunteered to go and get myself a drink of water, which I would need to walk past the pantry to do. I got up and I walked past the door and sneakily looked inside as I walked past. And sure enough, he was still standing in there. I went back and told my friend, and we both just lied there in silence until about 10 minutes later, the pantry door opens and he walks out and goes to bed. Me and my friend were really freaked out, but eventually we fell asleep from tiredness. We both remember it though, and I have slept there since, but he's never done the same thing since then. In fact, his dad has always been really nice. And I guess that this leaves me to wonder, since it was so dark, if it was actually his dad at all. Maybe it was somebody else.